Aldous Huxley's EYELESS in GAZA. Chapter 22. December 8th, 1926. Mark lived in a dingy house off the Fulham Road, dark brown brick with terracotta trimmings, and within, patterned linoleum, bits of red Axminster carpet, wallpapers of ochre sprinkled with bunches of cornflowers, of green with crimson roses, fumed oak chairs and tables, rep curtains, bamboo stands supporting glazed blue pots. The hideousness, Anthony reflected, was so complete, so absolutely unrelieved, that it could only have been intentional. Mark must deliberately have chosen the ugliest surroundings he could find to punish himself, no doubt. But why? For what offense? Some beer? Anthony nodded. The other opened a bottle, filled the glass, but himself did not drink. "You still play, I see," said Anthony, pointing in the direction of the upright piano. "A little," Mark had to admit. "It's a consolation. The fact that the Matthew Passion, for example, the Hammerklavier Sonata, had had human authors was a source of hope. It was just conceivable that humanity might someday and somehow be made a little more John Sebastian-like. If there were no well-tempered clavichord, why should one bother even to wish for revolutionary change? Turning one kind of common humanity into common humanity of a slightly different kind. Well, if that's all that revolution can do, the game isn't worth the candle." Anthony protested. For a sociologist, it was the most fascinating of all games. To watch or to play? To watch, of course. A spectacle, bottomlessly comic in its grotesqueness, endlessly varied. But looking closely, one could detect the uniformities under the diversity, the fixed rules of the endlessly shifting game. A revolution to transform common humanity into common humanity of another variety. You find it horrifying, but that's just what I'd like to live long enough to see. Theory being put to the test of practice, to detect, after your catastrophic reform of everything, the same old uniformities working themselves out in a slightly different way. I can't imagine anything more satisfying, like logically inferring the existence of a new planet and then discovering it with the telescope. As for producing more John Sebastians, he shrugged his shoulders. You might as well imagine that revolution will increase the number of Siamese twins. That was the chief difference between literature and life. In books, the proportion of exceptional to commonplace people is high. In reality, very low. "Books are opium," said Mark. "Precisely. That's why it's doubtful if there'll ever be such a thing as proletarian literature. Even proletarian books will deal with exceptional proletarians, and exceptional proletarians are no more proletarian than exceptional bourgeoisie are bourgeoisie. Life so ordinary that literature has to deal with the exceptional. Exceptional talent, power, social position, wealth. Hence those geniuses of fiction, those leaders and dukes and millionaires. People who are completely conditioned by circumstances. One can be desperately sorry for them, but one can't find their lives very dramatic. Drama begins where there's freedom of choice, and freedom of choice begins when social or psychological conditions are exceptional. That's why the inhabitants of imaginative literature have always been recruited from the pages of who's who. But do you really think that people with money or power are free? Freer than the poor, at any rate, less completely conditioned by matter and other people's wills. Mark shook his head. "You don't know my father," he said, "or my disgusting brothers." At Bulstrode, Anthony remembered, it was always my paterses, or my frater, at Cambridge. The whole vile brood of Staithes, Mark went on. He described the Staithes, who was now a knight commander of St. Michael and St. George, and a permanent under-secretary. Pleased as Punch with it all, and serenely conscious of his own extraordinary merits, adoring himself for being such a great man. As though there were any real difficulty in getting where he's got, anything in the least creditable about that kind of piddling little conquest. Mark made a flayed grimace of contemptuous disgust. He thinks he's a marvel. And the other Staithes, the Staithes of the younger generation, they also thought that they were marvels. There was one of them at Delhi, heroically occupied in bullying Indians who couldn't stand up for themselves, and the other was on the stock exchange and highly successful. Successful as what? As a cunning exploiter of ignorance and greed and the insanity of gamblers and misers. And on top of everything, the man prided himself on being an amorist, a professional Don Juan. Why the poor devil shouldn't be allowed to have a bit of fun, Anthony was unable, as he sipped his beer, to imagine. One of the boys, one of the dogs, a dog among bitches. What a triumph. "And you call them free," Mark concluded. "But how can a climber be free? He's tied to his ladder." "But social ladders," Anthony objected, "become broader as they rise. At the bottom, you can only just get your foot on to them. At the top, the rungs are 20 yards across." "Well, perhaps it's a wider perch than the bank clerks," Mark admitted. "But not wide enough for me, and not high enough. Above all, not clean enough." The rage they had been in when he enlisted during the war as a private, feeling that he'd let the family down. The creatures were incapable of seeing that. If you had the choice, it was more decent to elect to be a private than a staff lieutenant. "Turds to the core," he said. "So they can't think anything but turdish thoughts, and above all, they can't conceive of anyone else thinking differently. Turd calls to turd, and when it's answered by non-turd, it's utterly at a loss. And when the war was over, there was that job his father had taken such pains to find for him in the city, with Lazarus and Coit, no less, just waiting for him to step into the moment he was demobilized. A job with almost unlimited prospects for a young man with brains and energy. For a Staithes, or a Staithes, in a word, a 5-figure income by the time you're 50, his father had insisted almost lyrically, and had been really hurt and grieved, as well as mortally offended, furiously angry, when Mark replied that he had no intention of taking it. "But why not?" the poor old turd kept asking. "Why not?" And simply couldn't see that it was just because it was so good that I couldn't take his job. So unfairly good, so ignobly good. He just couldn't see it. According to his ideas, I ought to have rushed at it, headlong, like all the Gadarene swine rolled into one. instead of which I returned him his cowpat and went to Mexico to look after a coffee finca. But did you know anything about coffee? Of course not. That was one of the attractions of the job. He smiled. When I did know something about it, I came back to see if there was anything doing here. And is there anything doing? The other shrugged his shoulders. God only knew. One joined the party, one distributed literature, one financed pressure groups out of the profits on synthetic carnations, one addressed meetings and wrote articles. And perhaps it was all quite useless. Perhaps, on the contrary, the auspicious moment might someday present itself. And then what? Asked Anthony. Ah, that's the question. It'll be all right at the beginning. Revolution's delightful in the preliminary stages, so long as it's a question of getting rid of the people at the top. But afterwards, if the thing's a success, what then? More wireless sets, more chocolates, more beauty parlors, more girls with better contraceptives? He shook his head. The moment you give people the chance to be piggish, they take it. Thankfully. That freedom you were talking about just now, the freedom at the top of the social ladder, it's just the license to be a pig, or alternatively, a prig, a self-satisfied Pharisee, like my father. Or else both at once, like my precious brother, pig and prig simultaneously. In Russia, they haven't yet had the chance to be pigs. Circumstances have forced them to be aesthetics. But suppose their economic experiment succeeds. Suppose a time comes when they're all prosperous. What's to prevent them turning into babbits? Millions and millions of soft, piggish babbits ruled by a small minority of ambitious Stathases. Anthony smiled. A new phase of the game played according to the old, unchanging rules. I'm horribly afraid you're right, said the other. It's orthodox Marxism, of course. Behavior and modes of thought are the outcome of economic circumstances. Reproduce Babbitt's circumstances, and you can't help reproducing his manners and customs. Christ! He rose, walked to the piano, and drawing up a chair, sat down in front of it. Let's try to get that taste out of our mouths. He held his large bony hands poised for a moment above the keyboard, then began to play Bach's toccata and fugue in D. They were in another universe, a world where Babbitts and Stathases didn't exist, were inconceivable. Mark had played for only a minute or two when the door opened and an elderly woman, thin and horse-faced, in a brown silk dress and wearing round her neck an old diseased brown fur, entered the room. She walked on tiptoe, acting in elaborate pantomime the very personification of silence, but in the process produced an extraordinary volume and variety of disturbing noises. Creaking of shoes, rustling of silk, glassy clinkings of bead necklaces, jingling of the silver objects suspended by little chains from the waist. Mark went on playing without turning his head. Embarrassed, Anthony rose and bowed. The horse-faced creature waved him back to his place, and cautiously, in a final prolonged explosion of noise, sat down on the sofa. Exquisite, she cried, when the final chord had been struck. Play us something more, Mark. But Mark got up, shaking his head. I want to introduce you to Miss Pendle, he said to Anthony, and to the old woman. Anthony Beavis was at Bulstrode with me, he explained. Anthony took her hand. She gave him a smile. The teeth, which were false ones, and badly fitting, were improbably too white and bright. "So you were at Bulstrode with Mark," she cried. "Isn't that extraordinary?" "Extraordinary that we should still be on speaking terms?" said Mark. "No, no," said Mrs. Pendle, and with a playfulness that Anthony found positively ghoulish, gave him a little slap on the arm. "You know exactly what I mean. He always was like that, Mr. Bevis, even when he was a boy. Do you remember?" Anthony duly nodded assent. "So sharp and sarcastic, even before you knew him at Bulstrode. Shocking!" She flashed her false teeth at Mark in a sparkle of loving mock reprobation. "He was my first pupil, you know," she went on confidently, "and I was his first teacher." Anthony rose gallantly to the occasion. "Let me congratulate Mark," he said, "and condole with you." Miss Pendle looked at Mark. "Do you think I need his condolences?" she asked, almost archly, like a young girl, coquettishly fishing for compliments. Mark did not answer, only smiled and shrugged his shoulders. "I'll go and make some tea," he said. "You'd like tea, wouldn't you, Penny?" Miss Pendle nodded, and he rose and left the room. Anthony was wondering rather uncomfortably what he should say to this disquietingly human old nag, when Miss Pendle turned towards him. "He's wonderful, Mark is, really wonderful." The false teeth flashed. The words came gushingly with an incongruously unequine vehemence. Anthony felt himself writhing with an embarrassed distaste. "Nobody knows how kind he is," she went on. "He doesn't like it told, but I don't mind. I want people to know." She nodded so emphatically that the beads of her necklace rattled. "I was ill last year," she went on. Her savings had gone. She couldn't get another job. In despair, she had written to some of her old employers, Sir Michael Staithes among them. "Sir Michael sent me £5, she said. That kept me going for a bit. Then I had to write again. He said he couldn't do anything more, but he mentioned the matter to Mark. And what do you think Mark did?" She looked at Anthony in silence, a horse transfigured with an expression at once of tenderness and triumph, and her red-lidded brown eyes full of tears. "What did he do?" asked Anthony. "He came to me where I was staying. I had a room in Camberwell then. He came and took me away with him. Straight away, that moment, I could get my things packed up, and brought me here. I've kept house for him ever since. What do you think of that, Mr. Bevis?" she asked. Her voice trembled, and she had to wipe her eyes. But she was still triumphant. "What do you think of that?" Anthony really didn't know what to think of it, but said, meanwhile, that it was wonderful. "Wonderful," the horse repeated, approvingly. "That's exactly what it is. But you mustn't tell him I told you. He'd be furious with me. He's like that text in the Gospel about not letting your left hand know what your right hand is doing. That's what he's like." She gave her eyes a final wipe and blew her nose. "There, I hear him coming," she said, and before Anthony could intervene, had jumped up, darted across the room in a storm of rustlings and rattlings, and opened the door. Mark entered, carrying a tray with the tea things and a plate of mixed biscuits. Miss Pendle poured out, said she oughtn't to eat anything at this time of night, but all the same took a round biscuit with pink sugar icing on it. "Now, tell me what sort of a boy young Master Mark was at Bulstrode," she said in a playful way of hers. "Up to all kind of mischief, I'll be bound." She took another bite at her biscuit. "He bullied me a good deal," said Anthony. Miss Pendle interrupted her quick nibbling to laugh aloud. "You naughty boy," she said to Mark. Then the jaws started to work again. "Being so good at football, he had a right to bully me." "Yes, you were captain of the 11, weren't you?" "I forget," said Mark. "He forgets," Miss Pendle repeated, looking triumphantly at Anthony. "That's typical of him. He forgets." She helped herself to a second biscuit, pushing aside the plain ones to select another one with icing on it, and began to nibble once more with the intense and concentrated passion of those whose only sensual pleasures have been the pleasures of the palate. When she had gone to bed, the two men sat down again by the fire. There was a long silence. "She's rather touching," said Anthony at last. For some time Mark made no comment. Then, "A bit too touching," he brought out. Anthony looked into his face and saw there a demonstration of the anatomy of sardonic irony. There was another silence. The clock, which was supported by two draped nymphs in gilded bronze, ticked from its place among the imitation Dresden figures that thronged the shelves of the elaborate overmantel. "Hideous on purpose," Anthony said to himself, as his eye took in the details of each separate outrage on good taste. And the poor old horse. Was she merely the largest, the most monstrous of the knickknacks? "I'm surprised," he said aloud, "that you don't wear a hair shirt. Or perhaps you do," he added. Chapter 23. June 1st, 1934. Tonight at dinner with Mark, saw Helen for the first time since my return from America. Consider the meaning of a face. A face can be a symbol signifying matter, which would require volumes for its exposition in successive detail, a vast sum for the person on whom it acts as a symbol of feelings and thoughts, of remembered sensations, impressions, judgments, experiences, all rendered synthetically and simultaneously at a single glance. As she came into the restaurant, it was like the drowning man's instantaneous vision of life. A futile, bad, unsatisfactory life, and a vision charged with regret. All those wrong choices, those opportunities irrevocably missed. And that sad face was not only a symbol indirectly expressive of my history, it was also a directly expressive emblem of hers, a history, for whose saddening and embittering quality I was at least in part responsible. If I had accepted the love she wanted to give me, if I had consented to love, for I could have loved in return, but I preferred to be free for the sake of my work. In other words, to remain enslaved in a world where there could be no question of freedom, for the sake of my amusements. I insisted on irresponsible sensuality rather than love. Insisted, in other words, on her becoming a means to an end of my detached physical satisfaction, and conversely, of course, on my becoming a means to hers. Curious how irrelevant appears the fact of having been technically lovers. It doesn't qualify her indifference or my feeling. There's a maxim of Le Rochefoucauld's about women forgetting the favors they have accorded to past lovers. I used to like it for being cynical, but really it's just a bald statement of the fact that something that's meant to be irrelevant, i.e. sensuality, is irrelevant. Into my present complex of thoughts, feelings, and memories, physical desire, I find, enters hardly at all, in spite of the fact that my memories are of intense and complete satisfactions. Surprising, the extent to which eroticism is a matter of choice and focus. I don't think much in erotic terms now, but very easily could, if I wished to. Choose to consider individuals in their capacity as potential givers and receivers of pleasure. Focus attention on sensual satisfactions. Eroticism will become immensely important, and great quantities of energy will be directed along erotic channels. Choose a different conception of the individual, another focal range, energy will flow elsewhere, and eroticism seem relatively unimportant. Spent a good part of the evening arguing about peace and social justice. Mark, as sarcastically disagreeable as he knew how to be about Miller and what he called my Neo-Jesus avatar. If the swine want to rip one another's guts out, let them anyhow. You can't prevent them. Swine will be swine, but may become human, I insisted. Homo non nascitur, fit. Or rather, makes himself out of the ready-made elements and potentialities of man with which he's born. Helen's was the usual communist argument. No peace or social justice without a preliminary liquidation of capitalists, liberals, and so forth. As though you could use violent, unjust means and achieve peace and justice. Means determine ends, and must be like the ends proposed. Means intrinsically different from the ends proposed achieve ends like themselves, not like those they were meant to achieve. Violence and war will produce a peace and a social organization having the potentialities of more violence and war. The war to end war resulted, as usual, in a peace essentially like war. The revolution to achieve communism in a hierarchical state where a minority rules by police methods, a la Metternich, Hitler, Mussolini, and where the power to oppress in virtue of being rich is replaced by the power to oppress in virtue of being a member of the oligarchy. Peace and social justice, only obtainable by means that are just and pacific. And people will behave justly and pacifically only if they have trained themselves as individuals to do so, even in circumstances where it would be easier to behave violently and unjustly. And the training must be simultaneously physical and mental. Knowledge of how to use the self and what the self should be used for, Neo Ignatius and Neo Sandow, was Mark's verdict. Put Mark into a cab and walked, as the night was beautiful, all the way from Soho to Chelsea. Theaters were closing. Helen brightened suddenly to a mood of malevolent high spirits, commenting in a ringing voice on passers-by, as though we were at the zoo, embarrassing but funny and acute, as when she pointed to the rich young men in top hats trying to look like the de risque aristocrat, or opening and shutting cigarette cases in the style of Gerald du Maurier, to the women trying to look like Vogue or expensive advertisements for winter cruises or fur coats, head in air, eyelids dropped superciliously, or slouching like screen vamps with their stomachs stuck out, as though expecting twins, the pitiable models on which people form themselves. Once it was the imitation of Christ, now of Hollywood. We're silent when we had left the crowds. Then Helen asked if I were happy. I said yes, though didn't know if happiness was the right word. More substantial, more complete, more interested, more aware, if not happy exactly, at any rate, having greater potentialities for happiness. Another silence. Then, I thought I could never see you again because of that dog. Then Eki came, and the dog was quite irrelevant. And now, he's gone. It's still irrelevant. For another reason. Everything's irrelevant, for that matter, except communism. But that was an afterthought, an expression of piety, uttered by force of habit. I said our ends were the same. The means adopted different. For her, end justified means. For me, means the end. Perhaps, I said, one day she would see the importance of the means. June 3rd, 1934. At today's lesson with Miller, found myself suddenly step forward in my grasp of the theory and practice of the technique. To learn proper use, one must first inhibit all improper uses of the self. Refuse to be harried into gaining ends by the equivalent, in personal, psycho-physiological terms, of violent revolution. Inhibit this tendency, concentrate on the means whereby the end is to be achieved, then act. This process entails knowing good and bad use, knowing them apart, by the feel. Increased awareness and increased power of control result. Awareness and control. Trivialities take on new significance. Indeed, nothing is trivial anymore, or negligible. Cleaning teeth, putting on shoes. Such processes are reduced by habits of bad use to a kind of tiresome non-existence. Become conscious, inhibit, cease to be greedy and gainer, concentrate on means, tiresome non-existence turns into absorbingly interesting reality. In Evans Wentz' last book on Tibet, I find among the precepts of the gurus the injunction, constantly retain alertness of consciousness in walking, in sitting, in eating, in sleeping. An injunction, like most injunctions, unaccompanied by instructions as to the right way of carrying it out. Here, practical instructions accompany injunctions. One is taught how to become aware, and not only that, also how to perform rightly instead of wrongly, the activities of which there is awareness. Nor is this all. Awareness and power of control are transferable. Skill acquired in getting to know the muscular aspect of mind-body can be carried over into the exploration of other aspects. There is increasing ability to detect one's motives for any given piece of behavior, to assess correctly the quality of a feeling, the real significance of a thought. Also, one becomes more clearly and consistently conscious of what's going on in the outside world, and the judgment associated with that heightened consciousness is improved. Control also is transferred. Acquire the art of inhibiting muscular bad use, and you acquire thereby the art of inhibiting more complicated trains of behavior. Not only this, there is prevention as well as cure. Given proper correlation, many occasions for behaving undesirably just don't arise. There is an end, for example, of neurotic anxieties and depressions, whatever the previous history. For note, most infantile and adolescent histories are disastrous. Yet only some individuals develop serious neuroses. Those, precisely, in whom use the self is particularly bad. They succumb because resistance is poor. In practice, neuroses is always associated with some kind of wrong use. Note the typically bad physical posture of the neurotics and lunatics. The stooping back, the muscular tension, the sunken head. Re-educate. Give back correct physical use. You remove a keystone of the arch constituting the neurotic personality. The neurotic personality collapses, and in its place is built up a personality in which all the habits of physical use are correct. But correct physical use entails, since body-mind is indivisible, except in thought, correct mental use. Most of us are slightly neurotic. Even slight neuroses provides endless occasions for bad behavior. Teaching of right use, it gets rid of neuroses, therefore, of many occasions for bad behavior. Hitherto, preventative ethics had been thought of as external to individuals. Social and economic reforms carried out with a view to eliminating occasions for bad behavior. This is important, but not nearly enough. Belief that it is enough makes the social reform conception of progress non-essential. The knowledge that it is non-essential, belief that it is enough makes the social reform conception of progress nonsensical. The knowledge that it is nonsensical had always given me pleasure. Sticking pins in large, highly inflated balloons, one of the most delightful of amusements, but a bit childish, and after a time it palls. So how satisfactory to find that there seems to be a way of making sense of the nonsense. A method of achieving progress from within as well as from without. Progress not only as a citizen, a machine minder, and machine user, but also as a human being. Prevention is good, but can't eliminate the necessity for cure. The power to cure bad behavior seems essentially similar to the power to cure bad coordination. One learns this last when learning the proper use of self. There is a transference, the power to inhibit and control. It becomes easier to inhibit undesirable impulses, easier to follow as well as see and approve the better, easier to put good intentions into practice and be patient, good-tempered, kind, unrapacious, chaste. Chapter 24. June 23rd and July 5th, 1927. She couldn't afford it, but that didn't matter. Mrs. Amberley was used to doing things she couldn't afford. It was really so simple. You just sold a little war loan, and there you were. There you were with your motor tour in Italy, your nudes by Paskin, your account at Fortnum and Mason. And there, finally, you were in Berkshire, in the most adorable little old house smelling of potpourri, with towering lime trees on the lawn and the downs at your back door, stretching away mile after mile in smooth green nakedness under the sky. She couldn't afford it, but it was so beautiful, so perfect. And after all, what were £150 of war loan? How much did they bring in? About £5 a year, when the taxes had been paid. And what were £5 a year? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And besides, Jerry was going to reinvest her money for her. Her capital might have shrunk, but her income would soon start growing. Next year she would be able to afford it, and so, in anticipation of that happy time, here she was, sitting under the lime trees on the lawn with her guest around her. Propped up on one elbow, Helen was lying on a rug behind her mother's chair. She was paying no attention to what was being said. The country was so exquisitely beautiful that one really couldn't listen to old Anthony holding forth about the place of machines in history. No, the only thing one could do in such heavenly circumstances was to play with the kitten. You pushed a twig under the corner of the rug very slowly till the end reappeared again on the other side, like the head of an animal cautiously peering out from its burrow. A little way very suspiciously, and then with a jerk you withdrew it. The animal had taken fright and scuttled back to cover. Then, plucking up its courage, out it came once more, went nosing to right and left between the grass stems, then retired to finish its meal safely under the rug. Long seconds passed, and suddenly out it popped like a jack-in-a-box, as though it were trying to catch any impending danger unaware, and was back again in a flash. Then once more, very doubtfully and reluctantly, impelled only by brute necessity and against its better judgment, it emerged into the open, conscious, you felt, of being the predestined victim, foreknowing its dreadful fate. And all this time the tabby kitten was following its comings and goings with a bright, expressionless ferocity. Each time the twig retired under the rug, he came creeping with an infinity of precautions, a few inches nearer, nearer, and now the moment had come for him to crouch for the final decisive spring. The green eyes stared with an absurd balefulness. The tiny body was so heavily overcharged with a tigerish intensity of purpose that not the tail only, but the whole hindquarters, shook under the emotional pressure. Overhead, meanwhile, the lime trees rustled in a faint wind. The round dapplings of golden light moved noiselessly back and forth across the grass. On the other side of the lawn, the herbaceous borders blazed in the sunshine as though they were on fire, and beyond them lay the downs like huge animals, fast asleep, with the indigo shadows of clouds creeping across their flanks. It was all so beautiful, so heavenly, that every now and then Helen simply couldn't stand it any longer, but had to drop the twig and catch up the kitten and rub her cheek against the silky fur, and whisper meaningless words to him in baby language, and hold him up with ridiculously dangling paws in front of her face, so that their noses almost touched, and stare into those blankly bright green eyes, till at last the helpless little beast began to mew so pathetically that she had to let him go again. "Poor darling," she murmured, repentantly. "Did I torture him?" But the torturing had served its purpose. The painful excess of her happiness had overflowed, as it were, and left her at ease. The heavenly beauty was once more supportable. She picked up the twig, forgivingly, for he had already forgotten everything. The kitten started the game all over again. The ringing of the bicycle bell made her look up. It was the postman riding up the drive with the afternoon delivery. Helen scrambled to her feet and, taking the kitten with her, walked quickly, but, she hoped, inconspicuously, towards the house. At the door she met the parlour maid, coming out with the letters. There were two for her. The first she opened was from Joyce, from Aldershot. She had to smile as she read the address at the head of the paper. Joyce is now living at a Aldershot, her mother would say, lingering over the first syllable of the name with a kind of hollow emphasis and a tone of slightly shocked incredulity, as though it were really inconceivable that any daughter of hers should find herself at such a place. At Aldershot, my dear. And she managed to endow that military suburb with the fabulous strangeness of Tibet, the horror and remoteness of darkest Liberia, living at a Aldershot as a meme sahib. Just a line, Helen read, still smiling, to thank you for your sweet letter. I'm rather worried by what you say about mothers taking so many sleeping draughts. They can't be good for her. Colin thinks she ought to take more healthy exercise. Perhaps you might suggest riding. I have been having riding lessons lately, and it is really lovely once you are used to it. We are now quite settled in, and you have no idea how adorable our little house looks now. Colin and I worked like niggers to get things straight, but I must say the results are worth all the trouble. I had to pay a lot of nerve-wracking calls, but everybody has been very nice to me, and I feel quite at home now. Colin sends his love. Yours, Joyce. The other letter, and that was why she had gone to meet the postman, was from Hugh Ledwidge. If the letters had been brought to Mrs. Amberley on the lawn, if she had sorted them out in public, Helen flushed with imagined shame and anger at the thought of what her mother might have said about that letter from Hugh. In spite of all the people sitting round, or rather because of them, when they were alone, Helen generally got off with a teasing word. But when other people were there, Mrs. Amberley would feel inspired by her audience to launch into elaborate descriptions and commentaries. Hugh and Helen, she would explain, they're a mixture between Socrates and Alcibiades, and Don Quixote, and Dulcinea. There were moments when she hated her mother. It's a case, said the remembered voice, a case of, I could not love thee, dear, so much, loved I not ethnology more. Helen had to suffer a great deal on account of those letters. She tore open the envelope. "22 VI 27. Midsummer Day, Helen. But you're too young. I expect to think much about the significance of special days. You've only been in the world for about 7,000 days altogether, and one has got to have lived through at least 10,000 before one begins to realize that there aren't an indefinite number of them, and that you can't do exactly what you want with them. I've been here more than 13,000 days, and the end's visible. The boundless possibilities have narrowed down. One must cut according to one's cloth, and one's cloth is not only exiguous, it's also of one special kind, and generally of poor quality at that. When one's young, one thinks one can tailor one's time into all sorts of splendid and fantastic garments. Shakos and chasables and Ph.D. gowns, Nijinsky's tights, and Rimbaud's slate blue trousers, and Garibaldi's red shirt. But by the time you've lived 10,000 days, you begin to realize that you'll be lucky if you succeed in cutting one decent workaday suit out of the time at your disposal. It's a depressing realization, and midsummer is one of the days that brings it home. The longest day, one of the 60 or 70 longest days of one's 25,000. And what have I done with this longest day? Longest of so few, of so uniform, of so shoddy. The catalogue of my occupations would be humiliatingly absurd and pointless. The only credible and, in any profound sense of the word, reasonable thing I've done is to think a little about you, Helen, and write this letter. Any interesting letters? Asked Mrs. Amberley when her daughter came out again from the house. Only a note from Joyce. From our Mem Sahib. Helen nodded. She's living at Aldershot, you know, said Mary Amberley to the assembled company. At Aldershot, she insisted, dragging out the first syllable, till the place became ludicrously unreal. And the fact that Joyce lived there, a fantastic and slightly indecent myth. You can thank your lucky stars that you aren't living at Aldershot, said Anthony. After all, you ought to be a general's daughter. For the first moment, Mary was put out by his interruption. She had looked forward to developing her fantastic variations on the theme of Aldershot, but her good humor returned as she perceived the richer opportunity with which he had provided her. Yes, I know, she cried eagerly. A general's daughter. And do you realize that, but for the grace of God, I might at this moment be a colonel's wife? I was within an ace of marrying a soldier. Within an ace, I tell you. The most ravishingly beautiful creature. But ivory, she rapped her forehead. Solid ivory. It was lucky he was such a crashing bore. If he'd been the tiniest bit brighter, I'd have gone out to India with him. And then what? It's unimaginable. Unimaginable, Beppo repeated, with a little squirt of laughter. On the contrary, said Anthony, perfectly imaginable. The club, every evening between 6 and 8, parties at Government House, adultery in the hot weather, polo in the cold, incessant bother with the Indian servants, permanent money difficulties and domestic scenes, occasional touches of malaria and dysentery. The monthly parcel of second-hand novels from the Times Book Club, and all the time the inexorable advance of age, twice as fast as in England. If you've ever been to India, nothing's more easy to imagine. And you think all that would have happened to me? Asked Mary. What else could have happened? You don't imagine you'd have gone about buying paskins in Quetta? Mary laughed. Or reading Max Jacob in Rawalpindi? You'd have been a Mem Sahib, like all the other Mem Sahibs. A bit more bored and discontented than most of them, perhaps, but still a Mem Sahib. I suppose so, she agreed. But is one so hopelessly at the mercy of circumstances? He nodded. You don't think I'd have escaped? I can't see why. But that means there isn't really any such thing as me. Me, she repeated, laying a hand on her breast. I don't really exist. No, of course you don't. Not in that absolute sense. You're a chemical compound, not an element. But if one doesn't really exist, one wonders why. She hesitated. Why one makes such a fuss about things, Anthony suggested. All that howling and hurrahing and gnashing of teeth about the adventures of a self that isn't really a self, just the result of a lot of accidents. And of course, he went on, once you start wondering, you see at once that there is no reason for making such a fuss. And then you don't make a fuss. That is, if you're sensible, like me. He added, smiling. There was a silence. You don't make a fuss, Mrs. Amberley repeated to herself, and thought of Jerry Watchett. You don't make a fuss. But how was it possible not to make a fuss when he was so stupid, so selfish, so brutal, and at the same time so excruciatingly desirable? Like water in the desert, like sleep after insomnia. She hated him, but the thought that in a few days he would be there, staying in the house, sent a prickling sensation of warmth through her body. She shut her eyes and drew a deep breath. Still carrying the kitten, like a furry baby, in her arms, Helen had walked away across the lawn. She wanted to be alone, out of earshot of that laughter, those jarringly irrelevant voices. 7,000 days, she repeated again and again, and it was not only the declining sun that made everything seem so solemnly and richly beautiful. It was also the thought of the passing days, of human limitations, of the final, unescapable dissolution. 7,000 days, she said aloud. 7,000 days. The tears came into her eyes. She pressed the sleeping kitten closely to her breast. Savernake, the White Horse, Oxford, and in between whiles the roar and screech of Jerry's Bugatti, the rush of the wind, the swerves and bumps, the sickening but at the same time delicious terrors of excessive speed. And now they were back again, after an age it seemed, and at the same time it was as though they had never been away. The car came to a halt, but Helen made no move to alight. "What's the matter?" Jerry asked. "Why don't you get out?" "It seems so terribly final," she said with a sigh. "Like breaking a spell, like stepping out of the magic circle." "Magic?" he repeated questioningly. "What kind? White or black?" Helen laughed. "Piebald! Absolutely heavenly and absolutely awful. You know, Jerry, you ought to be put in gaol the way you drive. Or in a lunatic asylum, crazy and criminal. But I adored it," she added, as she opened the door and stepped out. "Good," was all he answered, while he gave her a smile that was as studiously unamorous as he could make it. He threw the car into gear, and in a stink of burnt castor oil, shot off round the house towards the garage. Charming, he was thinking, and how wise he had been to take that jolly, honest-to-God, big brother line with her. Ground bait, getting the game accustomed to you. She'd soon be eating out of his hand. The real trouble, of course, was Mary. Tiresome bitch, he thought, with a sudden passion of loathing, jealous, suspicious, interfering, behaving as though he were her private property, and greedy, insatiable, perpetually thrusting herself upon him, thrusting that aging body of hers. His face, as he maneuvered the car into the garage, was puckering into folds of distaste. But thank God, he went on to reflect, she'd got this chill on the liver, or whatever it was. That ought to keep her quiet for a bit, keep her out of the way. Without troubling to take off her coat, and completely forgetting her mother's illness, and for the moment her very existence, Helen crossed the hall, and almost running, burst into the kitchen. "Where's Tompy, Mrs. Weeks?" she demanded of the cook. The effect of the sunshine and the country and Jerry's Bugatti had been such that it was now absolutely essential to her that she should take the kitten in her arms. Immediately. "I must have Tompy," she insisted, And by the way of excuse and explanation, I didn't have time to see him this morning," she added. "We started in such a hurry. Tommy doesn't seem to be well, Miss Helen." Mrs. Weeks put away her sewing. "Not well? I put him in here," Mrs. Weeks went on, getting up from her Windsor chair and leading the way to the scullery. "It's cooler. He seemed to feel the heat so, as though he was feverish. I'm sure I don't know what's the matter with him," she concluded in a tone half of complaint, half of sympathy. She was sorry for Tommy, but she was also sorry for herself because Tommy had given her all this trouble. The kitten was lying in the shadow under the sink, crouching down beside the basket. Helen stretched out her hand to take him, then, with a little exclamation of horror, withdrew it, as though from the contact of something repellent. "But what has happened to him?" she cried. The little cat's tabby coat had lost all its smoothness, all its silky lustre, and was matted into damp, uneven tufts. The eyes were shut and gummy with a yellow discharge. A running at the nose had slimed the beautifully patterned fur of the face. The absurd, lovely little Tommy she had played with only yesterday, the comic and exquisite Tommy she had held up, pathetically helpless, in one hand, had rubbed her face against, had stared into the eyes of, was gone, and in his place lay a limp, unclean little rag of living refuse. Like those kidneys, it suddenly occurred to her with a qualm of disgust, and at once she felt ashamed of herself for having had the thought, for having, in that first gesture of recoil, automatically acted upon the thought even before she had consciously had it. "How beastly I am," she thought. "Absolutely beastly." Tommy was sick, miserable, dying perhaps, and she had been too squeamish even to touch him. Making an effort to overcome her distaste, she reached out once more, picked up the little cat, and with fingers of her free hand caressed with what a sickening reluctance the dank, bedraggled fur. The tears came into her eyes, overflowed, ran down her cheeks. "It's too awful. It's too awful," she repeated in a breaking voice. "Poor little Tommy. Beautiful, adorable, funny little Tommy. Murdered. No, worse than murdered. Reduced to a squalid little lump of dirt. For no reason, just senselessly. And on this day of all days, this heavenly day with the clouds over the White House, the sunshine between the leaves in Savernake Forest. And now, to make it worse, she was disgusted by the poor little beast, couldn't bear to touch him, as though he were one of those filthy kidneys. She who had pretended to love him, who did love him, she insisted to herself. But it was no good, her holding him like this and stroking him. It made no difference to what she was really feeling. She might perform the gesture of overcoming her disgust, but the disgust was still there, in spite of the love. She lifted a streaming face to Mrs. Weeks. "What shall we do?" Mrs. Weeks shook her head. "I never found there was much you could do," she said. "Not with cats." "But there must be something." "Nothing except leave them alone," insisted Mrs. Weeks, with a pessimism evidently reinforced by her determination not to be bothered. Then, touched by the spectacle of Helen's misery, "He'll be all right, dear," she added consolingly. "There's no need to cry. Just let him sleep it off." Footsteps sounded on the flagstones of the stable yard, and through the open window came the notes of "Yes, sir. She's my baby," whistled slightly out of tune. Helen straightened herself up from her crouching position, and leaning out, "Jerry," she called. then added in response to his expression of surprised commiseration. "Something awful has happened." In his large, powerful hands, Tommy seemed more miserably tiny than ever. But how gentle he was, and how efficient. Watching him, as he swabbed the little cat's eyes, as he wiped away the slime from the nostrils, Helen was amazed by the delicate precision of his movements. She herself, she reflected, with a heightened sense of her own shameful ineptitude, had been incapable of doing anything except stroke Tompy's fur and feel disgusted. Hopeless, quite hopeless. And when he asked for her help in getting Tompy to swallow half an aspirin tablet crushed in milk, she bungled everything and split the medicine. "Perhaps I can do it better by myself," he said, and took the spoon from her. And when he asked for her help in getting Tompy to swallow half an aspirin tablet crushed in milk, she bungled everything and spilt the medicine. "Perhaps I can do it better by myself," he said, and took the spoon from her. The cup of her humiliation was full. Mary Amberley was indignant. Here she was, feverish and in pain, worrying herself, what was more, into her higher fever, worse pain, with thought of Jerry's dangerous driving. And here was Helen, casually strolling into her room after having been in the house for more than 2 hours. More than 2 hours without having had the common decency to come and see how she was. More than 2 hours while her mother, mind you, had lain there in an agony of distress, thinking that they must have had an accident. "But Tompy was dying," Helen explained. "He's dead now." Her face was very pale, her eyes red with tears. "Well, if you prefer a wretched cat to your mother. Besides, you were asleep. If you hadn't been asleep, you'd have heard the car coming back. Now you're grudging me my sleep," said Mrs. Amberley bitterly. "Aren't I to be allowed a moment's respite from pain?" Bitterly. "Aren't I to be allowed a moment's respite from pain? Besides," she added, "I wasn't asleep. I was delirious. I've been delirious several times today. Of course, I didn't hear the car." Her eyes fell on the bottle of somnophane standing on the table by her bed, and the suspicion that Helen might also have noticed it made her still more angry. "I always knew you were selfish," she went on, "but I must say I didn't think you'd be quite as bad as this." At another time, Helen would have flared up in angry self-defense, or else, convicted of guilt, would have burst out crying. But today she was feeling too miserable to be able to shed any more tears, too much subdued by shame and unhappiness to resent even the most flagrant injustice. Her silence exasperated Mrs. Amberley still further. "I always used to think," she resumed, "that you were only selfish from the thoughtlessness. But now I see that it's heartlessness, plain heartlessness. Here am I, having sacrificed the best years of my life to you, and what do I get in return?" Her voice trembled as she asked the question. She was convinced of the reality of that sacrifice, profoundly moved by the thought of its extent, its martyr-like enormity, the most cynical indifference. "I might die in a ditch, but you wouldn't care. You'd be much more upset about your cat. And now go away," she almost shouted. "Go away. I know my temperature's gone up. Go away." After a lonely dinner, for Helen was keeping to her room on the plea of a headache. Jerry was up to sit with Mrs. Amberley. He was particularly charming that evening, and so affectionately solicitous that Mary forgot all her accumulated grounds of complaint and fell in love with him all over again, and for another set of reasons, not because he was so handsome, so easily and insolently dominating, such a ruthless and accomplished lover, but because he was kind, thoughtful, and affectionate, was everything, in a word, she had previously known he wasn't. 10:30 struck. He rose from his chair. "Time for your spot of shut-eye." Mary protested. He was firm. For her own good. 30 drops for the normal dose of somnifame. But he measured out 45, so as to make quite sure of her sleeping, made her drink, then tucked her up. Like an old nanny, she cried, laughing with pleasure, as he busied himself round the bed, and, after kissing her good night, with an almost maternal tenderness, turned out the light and left her. The clock of the village church sounded 11. How sadly, Helen thought, as she listened to the strokes of the distant bell. How lonelily it was, as though she were listening to the voice of her own spirit, reverberated in some mysterious way from the walls of the enclosing night. One, two, three, four. Each sweet, cracked note seemed more hopelessly mournful, seemed to rise from the depths of a more extreme solitude than the last. Tompi had died, and she hadn't even been capable of giving him a spoonful of milk and crushed aspirin, hadn't had the strength to overcome her disgust. Selfish and heartless, her mother was quite right, but lonely as well as selfish, all alone among the senseless malignancies that had murdered poor little Tompi, and her heartlessness spoke with the despairing voice of that bell. Night was empty and enormous all around. "Helen!" She started and turned her head. The room was impenetrably black. "It's me," Jerry's voice continued. "I was so worried about you. Are you feeling better?" Her first surprise and alarm had given place to a feeling of resentment that he should intrude upon the privacy of her unhappiness. "You needn't have bothered," she said coldly. "I'm quite all right." Enclosed in his faint aura of Turkish tobacco, of peppermint-flavored toothpaste, and bay rum, he approached invisibly. Through the blanket, a groping hand touched her shin. Then the springs creaked and tilted under his weight as he sat down on the edge of the bed. "Felt a bit responsible," he went on. "All that looping the loop." The tone of his voice implied the unseen smile, suggesting a whimsical and affectionate twinkling of hidden eyes. She made no comment. There was a long silence. A bad start, Jerry thought, and frowned to himself in the darkness, then began again on another tack. "I can't help thinking of that miserable little Tompi," he said in a different voice. "Extraordinary how upsetting it is when an animal gets ill like that. It seems so frightfully unfair." In a few minutes she was crying, and he had an excuse to console her, gently as he had handled Tompi, and with all the tenderness that had so much touched Mrs. Amberley. He stroked her hair, and later, when her sobs began to subside, drew the fingers of his other hand along her bare arm, again and again, with the patient regularity of a nurse lulling her charge to sleep, again and again. 300 times at least, he was thinking, before he risked any gesture that could possibly be interpreted as amorous. 300 times, and even then the caresses would have to deviate by insensible degrees, as though by a series of accidents, till gradually, unintentionally, the hand that was now on her arm would come at last to be brushing with the same maternal persistence against her breast, while the fingers that came and went methodically among the curls would have strayed to the ear, and from the ear across the cheek to the lips, and would linger there lightly, chastely, but charged with the stuff of kisses, proxies, and forerunners of the mouth that would ultimately come down on hers through the darkness for the reward of its long patience. Chapter 25. May 20th, 1931. It was another knock. Fitzsimmons, Jeffries, Jack Johnson, Carpentier, Dempsey, Eugene Tunney. The champions came and went, but the metaphor in which Mrs. Beavis described his successive bereavements remained unaltered. Yes, a hard knock, and yet it seemed to Anthony there was a note almost of triumph in his father's reminiscences over the luncheon table of Uncle James as a schoolboy. Poor James, such curly hair he had then, nous et mortemur. The commiseration and regret were mingled with a certain satisfaction, the satisfaction of an old man who finds himself still alive, still able to attend the funerals of his contemporaries, his juniors. 2 years, he insisted. There was the best part of 2 years between James and me. I was Beavis major at school. He shook his head mournfully, but the old tired eyes had brightened with an irrepressible light. Poor James, he sighed. We hadn't seen one another much these last years, not since his conversion. How did he do it? It beats me. A Catholic. He of all people. Anthony said nothing, but after all, he was thinking. It wasn't so surprising. The poor old thing had grown up as a Bradlaugh atheist, ought to have been blissfully happy, parading his cosmic defiance, his unyielding despair, but had had the bad luck to be a homosexual at a time when one couldn't avow it even to oneself. Ingrowing pederasty. It had poisoned his whole life, had turned that metaphysical and delightfully Pickwickian despair into real common or garden misery, and neurasthenia. The old man had been half mad, really, which hadn't prevented him from being a first-rate actuary. Then, during the war, the clouds had lifted. One could be kind to wounded soldiers, be kind pro patria, and with a blameless conscience. Anthony remembered Uncle James' visit to him in hospital. He had come almost every day, loaded with gifts for a dozen adopted nephews as well as for the real one. On his thin, melancholy face there had been in those days a perpetual smile, but happiness never lasts. The armistice had come, and after those 4 years in paradise, hell had seemed blacker than ever. In 1923, he had turned papist. It was only to be expected. But Mrs. Beavis simply couldn't understand the idea of James surrounded by Jesuits, James bobbing up and down at Mass, James going to Lourdes with his inoperable tumor, James dying with all the consolations of religion. It filled him with horrified amazement. And yet, said Anthony. "I admire the way they usher you out of life. Dying, it's apt to be an animal process, more exclusively animal even than seasickness." He was silent for a moment, thinking of poor Uncle James' last and most physiological hour. The heavy, snoring breath, the mouth cavernously gaping, the scrabbling of the hands. How wise the Church has been to turn it into a ceremonial. "Charades," said Mrs. Beavis contemptuously. "But good charades," Anthony insisted. "A work of art, in itself. The event, like a rough channel crossing, only rather worse. But they managed to turn it into something rather fine and significant. Chiefly for the spectator, of course, but perhaps also significant for the actor." There was silence. The maid changed the plates and brought in the sweet. "Some apple tart?" Pauline questioned, as she cut the crust. "Apple pie, my dear." Mr. Beavis' tone was severe. "When will you learn that a tart's uncovered? A thing with a roof is a pie." They helped themselves to cream and sugar. "By the way," said Pauline suddenly, "had you heard about Mrs. Fox?" Anthony and Mr. Beavis shook their heads. "Maggie Clark told me yesterday. She's had a stroke." "Dear, dear," said Mr. Beavis. Then, reflectively, "Curious the way people pass out of one's life," he added, "after being very much in it. I don't believe I've seen Mrs. Fox half a dozen times in the last 20 years. And yet, before that—" "She had no sense of humor," said Pauline, by way of explanation. Mr. Beavis turned to Anthony. "I don't suppose you've, kept up with her very closely, not since that poor boy of hers died?" Anthony shook his head, without speaking. It was not agreeable to be reminded of all that he had done to avoid keeping up with Mrs. Fox. Those long, affectionate letters she had written to him during the first year of the war, letters which he had answered more and more briefly, perfunctorily, conventionally, and at last hadn't answered at all, hadn't even read, and yet, moved by some superstitious compunction, had never thrown away. At least a dozen of the blue envelopes, addressed in the large, clear-flowing writing, were still lying unopened in one of the drawers of his desk. Their presence there was, in some obscure, inexplicable way, a salve to his conscience. Not an entirely effective salve. His father's questions had made him feel uncomfortable. He hastened to change the subject. "And what have you been delving into recently?" he asked in a sort of playfully archaic language that his father might have used. Mr. Beavis chuckled and began to describe his researches into modern American slang, such savory locutions, such an Elizabethan wealth of new coinages and original metaphors. Horse feathers, dish the dope, button up your face. Delicious. "And now, would you like to be called a feverfrau?" he asked his younger daughter, Diana, who had sat in silence, severely aloof, throughout the meal. "Or worse, a cinch pushover, my dear?" "Or I might say that you had a dame complex, Anthony. Or refer, regretfully, to your habit of smooching the sex jobs." He twinkled with pleasure. "It's like so much Chinese," said Pauline from the other end of the table. Across her round placid face mirth radiated out in concentric waves of soft pink flesh. The succession of her chins shook like jelly. "He thinks he's the cat's pajamas, your father does." She reached out helped herself to a couple of chocolate creams from the silver bowl on the table in front of her, and popped one of them into her mouth. "The cat's pajamas," she repeated, indistinctly, and heaved with renewed laughter. Mr. Beavis, who had been working himself up to the necessary pitch of naughtiness, leaned forward and asked Anthony in a confidential whisper, "What would you do if the feverfraw had the misfortune to be storked?" They were darlings, Diana was thinking. That went without saying. But how silly they could be, how inexpressibly silly. All the same, Anthony had no right to criticize them, and under that excessive politeness of his, he obviously was criticizing them. The wretch. She felt quite indignant. Nobody had a right to criticize them except herself, and possibly her sister. She tried to think of something unpleasant to say to Anthony, but he had given her no opening, and she had no gift for epigram. She had to be content with silently frowning. And anyhow, it was time to go back to the lab. Getting up, "I must go," she said in her curt, abrupt way. "I absolutely forbid you to eat all those sweets," she added, as she bent down to kiss her mother. "Doctor's orders. You're not a doctor yet, darling." "No, but I shall be next year." Tranquilly, Pauline poked the second chocolate cream into her mouth. "And next year, perhaps, I'll stop eating sweets," she said. Anthony left a few minutes later. Walking through South Kensington, he found his thoughts harking back to Mrs. Fox. Had the stroke, he wondered, been a bad one? Was she paralyzed? He had been so anxious to prevent his father from talking about her that there had been no time for Pauline to say. He pictured her lying helpless, half dead, and was horrified to find himself feeling, along with sympathy, a certain satisfaction, a certain sense of relief. For after all, she was the chief witness for the prosecution, the person who could testify most damningly against him. Dead or only half dead, she was out of court, and in her absence there was no longer any case against him. With part of his being, he was glad of Pauline's news, shamefully glad. He tried to think of something else, and meanwhile boarded a bus so as to reach more quickly the haven of the London Library. He spent nearly 3 hours there, looking up reference to the history of the Anabaptists, and then walked home to his rooms in Bloomsbury. He was expecting Gladys that evening before dinner. The girl had been a bit tiresome recently, but still, he smiled to himself with anticipatory pleasure. She was due at 6, but at 1:15 she had not yet come, nor yet at 1/2, nor yet at 7, nor yet at 7:30. At 8, he was looking at those blue envelopes, postmarked in 1914 and 1915, and addressed in Mrs. Fox's writing, looking at them and wondering, in the self-questioning despondency that had succeeded his first impatience and rage, whether he should open them. He was still wondering when the telephone bell rang, and there was Mark Staithes asking him if by any chance he was free for dinner. A little party had formed itself at the last moment. Pitchley would be there, and his wife, the psychologist, and that Indian politician, Sen, and Helen Ledgewood. Anthony put the letters back in their drawer and hurried out of the house. It was after 2:00. Anthony lay on his back, staring. Chapter 26. September 5th, 1933. It was after 2 o'clock. Anthony lay on his back, staring up into the darkness. Sleep, it seemed, deliberately refused to come, was being withheld by someone else, some malignant alien inhabiting his own body. Outside in the pine trees, the cicadas harped incessantly on the theme of their existence, and at long intervals a sound of cock-crowing would swell up out of the darkness, louder and nearer, until all the birds in the surrounding gardens were shouting defiance back and forth, peal answering peal. And then, for no reason, first one, then another fell silent, and the outburst died away fainter and fainter into increasing distance, right across France, he fancied, as he strained his ears after the receding sound in the hurrying wave of ragged crowning. Hundreds of miles, perhaps, and then somewhere the wave would turn and roll back again as swiftly as it had come. Back from the North Sea, perhaps, over the battlefields, round the fringes of Paris, and from bird to distant bird through the forest, then across the plains of Beauce, up, down the hills of Burgundy, and like another aerial river of sound, headlong down the valley of the Rhone, past Valence, past Orange and Avignon, past Arles and Aix, and across the bare hills of Provence, until there it was again, an hour after its previous passage, flowing tumultuously shrill across the cicadas' loud, unremitting equivalent of silence. He was reminded suddenly of a passage in Lawrence's The Man Who Died, and thankful for an excuse to interrupt for a little his vain pursuit of sleep, he turned on the light and went downstairs to look for the book. Yes, here it was. As he came out, the young cock crowed. It was a diminished, pinched cry, but there was that in the voice of the bird stronger than chagrin. It was the necessity to live, and even to cry out the triumph of life. The man who had died stood and watched the cock who had escaped and been caught, ruffling himself up, rising forward on his toes, throwing up his head, and parting his beak in another challenge from life to death. The brave sounds rang out, and though they were diminished by the cord round the bird's leg, they were not cut off. The man who had died looked nakedly on life, and saw a vast resoluteness everywhere, flinging itself up in stormy or subtle wave crest, foam tips emerging out of the blue invisible, a black-orange cock for the green flame tongues out of the extremes on the fig tree. They came forth, these things, and creatures of spring, glowing with desire and assertion. They came like crest of foam, out of the blue flood of the invisible desire, out of the vast invisible sea of strength, and they came colored and tangible, evanescent, yet deathless in their coming. The man who had died looked on the great swing into existence of things that had not died, but he saw no longer their tremulous desire to exist and to be. He heard instead their ringing, defiant challenge to all other things existing. Anthony read on till he had finished the story of the man who had died and come to life again, the man who was himself the escaped cock, then put away the book and went back to bed. The foam on the waves of that invisible sea of desire and strength. But life as such, he protested, inwardly, it was not enough. How could one be content with the namelessness of mere energy, and the less than individuality of a power that for all its mysterious divineness was yet unconscious beneath good and evil? The cicadas sounded incessantly, and again, at about 4, the tide of the cock crowing came sweeping across the land and passed on, out of hearing, towards Italy. Life, irrepressibly, living itself out. But there were emblems, he reflected, more vividly impressive than the crowing cock or the young leaves breaking out from the winter fig tree's bone-white skeleton. He remembered that film he had seen of the fertilization of a rabbit's ovum, spermatozoa, a span long on the screen, ferociously struggling towards their goal, the moon-like sphere of the egg, countless, aimed from every side, their flagella in frantic vibration. And now the foremost had reached their objective, were burrowing into it, thrusting through the outer wall of living matter, tearing away in their violent haste whole cells that floated off and were lost. And at last one of the invaders had penetrated to the quick of the nucleus. The act of fertilization was consummated, and suddenly the hitherto passive sphere stirred into movement. There was a violent spasm of contraction. Its smooth, rounded surface became corrugated, and in some way resistant to the other sperms that vainly threw themselves upon it. And then the egg began to divide, bending in its walls upon itself, till they met in the center. And there were 2 cells instead of 1. Then, as the 2 cells repeated the process, 4 cells, then 8, then 16. And within the cells the granules of protoplasm were in continuous motion, like peas in a boiling pot, but self-activated, moving by their own energy. In comparison with these minute fragments of living matter, the crowning cock, the cicadas endlessly repeating the proclamation of their existence, were only feebly alive. Life under the microscope seemed far more vehement and impressible than in the larger world, consolingly and at the same time appallingly irrepressible. For yes, it was also appalling, the awful unconsciousness of that unconquerable, crawling desire. And oh, the horror of that display of submental passion, of violent and impersonal egotism, intolerable unless one could think of it only as raw material and available energy. Yes, raw material and a stream of energy. Impressive for their quantity, their duration, but qualitatively they were only potentially valuable, would become valuable only when made up into something else, only when used to serve an ulterior purpose. For Lawrence, the animal purpose had seemed sufficient and satisfactory. The cock, crowing, fighting, mating, anonymously, the man anonymous, like the cock. Better such mindless anonymity, he had insisted, than the squalid relationships of human beings advanced halfway to consciousness, still only partially civilized. But Lawrence had never looked through a microscope, never seen biological energy in its basic, undifferentiated state. He hadn't wanted to look, had disapproved on principle of microscopes, fearing what they might reveal, and had been right to fear. Those depths beneath depths of namelessness, crawling irrepressibly, they would have horrified him. He had insisted that the raw material should be worked up, but worked only to a certain pitch and no further, that the primal crawling energy should be used for the relatively higher purposes of animal existence, but for no existence beyond the animal, arbitrarily, illogically. For the other ulterior purposes and organizations existed, and were not to be ignored. Moving through space and time, the human animal discovered them on his path, unequivocally present and real. Thinking and the pursuit of knowledge, These were purposes for which he himself had used the energy that crawled under the microscope, that crowed defiantly in the darkness. Thought as an end, knowledge as an end, and now it had become suddenly manifest that they were only means of definitely raw material, as life itself. Raw material. And he divided, he knew, what the finished product would have to be, and with part of his being, he revolted against the knowledge. What set about trying to turn his raw material of life, thought knowledge into that. At his time of life, and he a civilized human being, the mere idea was ridiculous, one of those absurd hangovers from Christianity, like his father's terror of the more disreputable realities of existence, like the hymn-singing of workmen during the general strike, the headaches, the hiccups of yesterday's religion. But with another part of his mind, he was miserably thinking that he would never succeed in bringing about the transformation of his raw material into the finished product, that he didn't know how or where to begin, that he was afraid of making a fool of himself, that he lacked the necessary courage, patience, strength of mind. At about 7, when behind the shutters the sun was already high above the horizon, he dropped off into a heavy sleep, and woke with a start 3 hours later to see Mark Staithes beside his bed and peering at him, smiling an amused and inquisitive gargoyle through the mosquito net. "Mark?" he questioned in astonishment. "What on earth?" "Bridal," said Mark, poking the muslin net. "Positively, premier communion. I've been watching you sleeping." "For long?" "Oh, don't worry," he said, replying not to the spoken, but to the unspoken question implied by Anthony's tone of annoyance. "You don't give yourself away in your sleep. On the contrary, you take other people in. I've never seen anyone look so innocent as you did under that veil, like the infant Samuel. Too sweet." Reminded of Helen's use of the same word on the morning of the catastrophe, Anthony frowned. Then, after a silence, "What have you come for?" he asked. "To stay with you. You weren't asked." "That remains to be seen," said Mark. "What do you mean?" "I mean you may discover it after the event." "Discover what?" "That you wanted to ask me, without knowing that you wanted it." "What makes you think that?" Mark drew up a chair and sat down before answering. "I saw Helen the night she got back to London." "Did you?" Anthony's tone was as blankly inexpressive as he could make it. "Where?" he added. "At Hugh's. Hugh was giving a party. There were some uncomfortable moments." "Why?" "Well, because she wanted them to be uncomfortable. She was in a queer state, you know." "Did she tell you why?" Mark nodded. "She even made me read your letter. The beginning of it, at least. I wouldn't go on." "Helen made you read my letter?" "Aloud. She insisted. But, as I say, she was in a very queer state." There was a long silence. "That's why I came here," he added at last. "Thinking that I'd be glad to see you," the other asked in an ironical tone. "Thinking that you'd be glad to see me," Mark answered gravely. After another silence, "Well, perhaps you're not altogether wrong," said Anthony. "In a way, of course, I simply hate the sight of you." He smiled at Mark. Nothing personal intended, mind you. "I should hate the sight of anyone just as much, but in another way I'm glad you've come. And this is personal, because I think you're likely to have some notion of what's what," he concluded with a non-committal vagueness. "If there's anybody who can," he was going to say, "help But the idea of being helped was so repugnant to him, seemed so grotesquely associated with the parson's well-chosen words after a death in the family, with the housemaster's frank, friendly talk about sexual temptations, that he broke off uncomfortably. "If anybody can make a sensible remark about it all," he began, again, on a different level of expression, "I think it's you." The other nodded, without speaking, and thought how typical it was of the man to go on talking about sensible remarks, even now. "I have a feeling," Anthony went on slowly, overcoming inward resistance in order to speak, "a feeling that I'd like to get it over, get things settled. On another basis," he brought out, as though under torture, "the present one." He shook his head. "I'm a bit bored with it." Then, perceiving, with a sense of shame, the ludicrous inappropriateness and the worse than ludicrous falsity of the understatement, "It won't do," he added resolutely. "It's a basis that can't carry more than the weight of a ghost. And in order to use it, I've turned myself into a ghost." After a pause, "These last few days," he went on slowly, "I've had a queer feeling that I'm not really there, that I haven't been there for years past. Ever since, well, I don't know exactly, know when, since before the war, I suppose." He could not bring himself to speak of Brian. "Not there," he repeated. "A great many people aren't there," said Mark. "Not as people, at any rate. Only as animals and incarnate functions." "Animals and incarnate functions," the other repeated. "You've said it exactly. But in most cases they have no choice. Non-entity is forced on them by circumstance, whereas I was free to choose. At any rate, so far as anybody is free to choose. If I wasn't there, it was on purpose." "And do you mean to say that you've only just discovered the fact that you've never been there?" Anthony shook his head. No, I've known it, of course, all the time. But theoretically, in the same way as one knows, well, for example, that there are birds that live symbiotic ally with wasps. A curious and interesting fact, but no more. I didn't let it be more. And then I had my justifications. Work too much, personal life would interfere with my work, and the need for freedom. Freedom to think, freedom to indulge my passion for knowing about the world, and freedom for its own sake. I wanted to be free, because it was intolerable not to be free. "I can understand that," said Mark, "provided that there's someone there who can enjoy the freedom, and provided," he added, "that someone makes himself conscious of being free, by overcoming the obstacles that stand in the way of freedom." "But how can you be free if there's no you?" "I've always put it the other way round," said Anthony. "How can you be free, or rather, for one must think of it impersonally, how can there be freedom, so long as the you persists? A you has got to be consistent and responsible, has got to make choices and commit itself. But if one gets rid of the you, one gets rid of responsibility and the need for consistency. One's free as a succession of unconditioned, uncommitted states without past or future, except in so far as one can't voluntarily get rid of one's memories and anticipations." After a silence, the staggering imbecility of old Socrates, he went on, "Imagining that one had only to know the correct line of conduct in order to follow it, one practically always knows it. And more often than not, one doesn't follow it. Or perhaps you're not like that," he added in another tone, looking at Mark through the mosquito net. "One's inclined to attribute one's own defects to everyone else. Weakness in my case, not to mention timidity," he added, with a laugh that uttered itself automatically, so deeply ingrained was the habit of half-withdrawing, as soon as it was spoken, anything in the nature of a personal confidant, of evoking in the listener's mind a doubt as to the seriousness of his intention in speaking. Timidity and downright cowardice, and indolence in regard to anything that isn't my work. He laughed again, as though it were all absurd, not worth mentioning. One forgets that other people may be different. Tough-minded, firm of purpose. I dare say you always do what you know is right. I always do it, Mark answered, whether it's right or wrong. He demonstrated the anatomy of a smile. Anthony lay back on his pillows, his hands clasped behind his head, his eyes half shut. Then, after a long silence, he turned to Staithes and said abruptly, "Don't you ever feel that you simply can't be bothered to do what you've decided on? Just now, for example, I found myself wondering all of a sudden why on earth I'd been talking to you like this, why I'd been thinking these things before you came, why I'd been trying to make up my mind to do something, wondering and feeling that I simply couldn't be bothered, thinking it would be better just to evade it all and go back to the familiar routine, the quiet life, even though the quiet life would be fatal, mortal, but all the same anything for it." He shook his head. "Probably if you hadn't come to shame me into some sort of resolution, that's what I would have done, escaped from it all, and gone back to the quiet life." He laughed. "And perhaps," he added, "I shall do it even now, in spite of you." He sat up, lifted the mosquito net, and stepped out of bed. "I'm going to have my bath." Chapter 27. May 27th, 1914. Anthony came down to breakfast to find his father explaining to the two children the etymology of what they were eating. Merely another form of pottage. You say porridge, just as you say, or rather, he twinkled at them, I hope you don't say shurrup or shut up. The two little girls went on stolidly eating. "Ah, Anthony," Mr. Beavis went on, "better late than never. What, no pottage this morning? But you'll have an Aberdeen cutlet, I hope?" Anthony helped himself to the haddock and sat down in his place. "Here's a letter for you," said Mr. Beavis, and handed it over. "Don't I recognize Brian's writing?" Anthony nodded. "Does he still enjoy his work at Manchester?" "I think so," Anthony answered, "except, of course, that he does too much. He's at the newspaper till 1 or 2 in the morning, and then from lunch to dinner he works at his thesis." "Well, it's good to see a young man who has the energy of his ambitions," said Mr. Beavis, "because, of course, he needn't work so hard. It's not as if his mother hadn't got the wherewithal." The wherewithal so exasperated Anthony that, though he found Brian's action absurd, it was with a cutting severity that he answered his father. "He won't accept his mother's money," he said very coldly. "It's a matter of principle." There was a diversion while the children put away their porridge plates and were helped to Aberdeen cutlets. Anthony took the opportunity to start reading his letter. "No news of you for a long time. Here all goes on as usual, or would do, if I were feeling a bit sprightlier. But sleep has been none too good, and internal workings not all they might be. Am slowing down, in consequence, on the thesis, as I can't slow down on the paper. All this makes me look forward longingly to our projected fortnight in Langdale. Don't let me down, for heaven's sake. What a bore one's carcass is when it goes in the least wrong. Even when it goes right, for that matter. Such a lot of unmodern inconveniences. I sometimes bitterly resent this physical predestination to scatology and obscenity. Write soon and let me know how you are, what you've been reading, whether you've met anybody of interest, and will you do me a kindness? John's in town, now staying with her aunt, and working for the charity organization people. Her father didn't want her to go, of course, preferred to have her at home, so that he could tyrannize her. There was a long battle, which he finally lost. She had been in town nearly a month now, for which I'm exceedingly thankful. But at the same time, for various reasons, feel a bit worried. If I could get away for the week's ends, I'd come myself. But I can't. And perhaps, in a certain sense, it's all for the best. In any present mouldy condition, I should be rather a skeleton at the feast. And besides, there are certain complications. I can't explain them in a letter, but when you come north in July, I'll try. I ought to have asked your advice before this. You're harder in the head than I am, which is ultimately the reason why I didn't talk to you about the matter, for fear of being thought a fool by you. Such is one's imbecility. But there, we'll discuss it all later. Meanwhile, will you get in touch with her? Take her out to a meal? Get her to talk? Then write and tell me how you think she's reacting to London, what she feels about life in general, and so forth. It's been a violent transition, from remote country to London, from cramping poverty to a rich house, from subjection to her father's bad-tempered tyranny to independence. A violent transition, and though I'm glad of it, I'm a bit nervous as to its effects. But you'll see. Yours, B. Anthony did see that same day. The old shyness he noticed as they shook hands in the lobby of the restaurant was still there, the same embarrassed smile, the same swaying movement of recoil. In face and body she was more of a woman than when he had seen her last, a year before. Seemed prettier, too, chiefly, no doubt, because she was better dressed. They passed into the restaurant and sat down. Anthony ordered the food and a bottle of Vouvray, then began to explore the ground. London. How did she like London? Adored it. Even the work? Not the office part, perhaps, but 3 times a week she helped at a creche. I love babies. Even those horrible little smelly ones? Joan was indignant. They're adorable. I love the work with them. Besides, it all allows me to enjoy all the rest of London with a clear conscience. I feel I paid for my theatres and dances. Shyness broke up her talk, plunged it, as it were, into alternate light and shade. At one moment she would be speaking with difficulty, hardly opening her lips, her voice low and indistinct, her face averted. The next, her timidity was swept aside by an uprush of strong feeling, delight or some distress or irrepressible mirth, and she was looking at him, with eyes grown suddenly and surprisingly bold, from almost inaudible. Her voice had become clear. The strong white teeth flashed between lips parted in a frank expression of feeling. Then suddenly she was as though appalled by her own daring. She became conscious of him as a possible critic. What was he thinking? Had she made a fool of herself? Her voice faltered. The blood rose to her cheeks. She looked down at her plate, and for the next few minutes he would get nothing but short mumbled answers to his questions, nothing but the most perfunctory of nervous laughs in response to his best efforts to amuse her. The food, however, and the wine did their work, and as the meal advanced, she found herself more at ease with him. They began to talk about Brian. "You ought to prevent him from working so hard," he said. "Do you think I don't try?" Then, with something almost like anger in her voice, "It's his nature," she went on. "He's so terribly conscientious." "It's your business to make him unconscientious." He smiled at her, expecting a return in kind, but instead of that, she frowned. Her face took on an expression of resentful misery. "It's easy for you to talk," she muttered. There was a silence, while she sat with downcast eyes, sipping her wine. They could have married, it occurred to him, for the first time, if Brian had consented to live on his mother. Why on earth, then, seeing how much he was in love with the girl? With the peach Melba, it all came out. "It's difficult to talk about," she said. "I've hardly mentioned it to anyone. But with you it's different. You've known Brian such a long time. You're his oldest friend. You'll understand. I feel I can tell you about it." Curious, but at the same time a little disquieted, he murmured something vaguely polite. She failed to notice the signs of his embarrassment. For her, at the moment, Anthony was only the heaven-sent opportunity for at last releasing in speech a flood of distressing feelings too long debarred from expression. "It's that conscientiousness of his. If you only knew. Why has he got the idea that there's something wrong about love? The ordinary, happy kind of love, I mean. He thinks it isn't right. He thinks he oughtn't to have those feelings." She pushed away her plate, and leaning forward, her elbows on the table, began to speak in a lower, more intimate tone of the kisses that Brian had given and been ashamed of, and those other kisses that, by way of atonement, he had refused to give. Anthony listened in astonishment. "Certain complications" was what Brian had written in his letter. It was putting it mildly. This was just craziness. Tragic, but also grotesque. Absurd. It occurred to him that Mary would find the story particularly ludicrous. "He said he wanted to be worthy of me," she went on. "Worthy of love. But all that happened was that it made me feel unworthy. Unworthy of everything, in every way. Guilty feeling. Feeling I'd done something wrong. And dirty, too, if you understand what I mean. As though I'd fallen into the mud." "But, Anthony, it isn't wrong, is it?" she questioned. "I mean, we'd never done anything that wasn't, well, you know, quite innocent. Why does he say he's unworthy and make me feel unworthy at the same time? Why does he?" she insisted. There were tears in her eyes. "He was always rather like that," said Anthony. "Perhaps his upbringing. His mother's a wonderful person," he added, dropping, as he suddenly realized, while the words were being spoken, into Mrs. Fox's own idiom, "but perhaps a bit oppressive, just for that reason." Joan nodded emphatically, but did not speak. It may be she's made him aim a bit too high, he went on. Too high all night, the line, if you see what I mean, even when he's not directly following her example. That business of not wanting to take her money, for instance. Joan caught up the subject with passionate eagerness. Yes, why does he want to be different from everyone else? After all, there are other good people in the world, and they don't feel it necessary to do it. Mind you, she added, looking up sharply into Anthony's face, as if trying to catch and quell any expression of disapproval there, or worse, of patronizing amusement. Mind you, I think it's wonderful of him to do it. Wonderful, she repeated with a kind of defiance. Then, resuming the critical tone which she would not allow Anthony to use, but to which it seemed to her that her own feelings for Brian gave her a right, all the same, she went on, I can't see how it would hurt him to take that money. I believe it was mostly his mother's doing. Surprised, but he told me that Mrs. Fox had tried to insist on his taking it. Oh, she made it seem as though she wanted him to take it. We were there for a week, and in May, to talk it over. She kept telling him that it wasn't wrong to take the money, and that he ought to think about me and getting married. But then, when Brian and I told her that I'd agree to his not taking it, she... Anthony interrupted her. But had you agreed? Joan dropped her eyes. In a way, she said sullenly. Then, looking up again with sudden anger, how could I help agreeing with him, seeing that was what he wanted to do, and would have done? What's more, even if I hadn't agreed. And besides, I've told you, there was something rather splendid and wonderful about it. Of course I had agreed, but agreeing didn't mean that I really wanted him to refuse the money. And that's where her falseness came in, pretending to think that I wanted him to refuse it, and congratulating me and him on what we'd done, saying we were heroic and all that, and so encouraging him to go on with the idea. It is her doing, I tell you, much more than you think. She was silent, and Anthony thought it best to allow the subject to drop. Heaven only knew what she'd say if he allowed her to go on talking about Mrs. Fox. Poor Brian, he said aloud, and added, taking refuge in platitude, the best is the enemy of the good. Yes, that's just it, she cried. The enemy of the good. He wants to be perfect, but look at the result. He tortures himself and hurts me. Why should I be made to feel dirty and criminal? Because that's what he's doing, when I've done nothing wrong, nor has he, for that matter. And yet he wants me to feel the same about him, dirty and criminal. Why does he make it so difficult for me? As difficult as he possibly can. Her voice trembled. The tears overflowed. She pulled out her handkerchief and quickly wiped her eyes. I'm sorry, she said. I'm making a fool of myself. But if you knew how hard it's been for me. I've loved him so much. I want to go on loving him. But he doesn't seem to want to allow me to. It ought to be so beautiful, but he does his best to make it all seem ugly and horrible. Then, after a pause, and in a voice that had sunk almost to a whisper, I sometimes wonder if I can go on much longer. Did it mean, he wondered, that she had already decided to break it off, had already met someone else who was prepared to love her and be loved less tragically, more normally than Brian? No, probably not, he decided. But there was every likelihood that she soon would. In her way, it didn't happen to be exactly the way he liked. She was attractive. There would be no shortage of candidates, and if a satisfactory candidate presented himself, would she be able, whatever she might consciously wish, to refuse? Joan broke the silence. "I dream so often of the house we're going to live in," she said, "going from room to room, and it all looks so nice. Such pretty curtains and chair covers and vases full of flowers." She sighed. Then, after a pause, "Do you understand his not wanting to take his mother's money?" Anthony hesitated a moment, then replied, non-committally, "I understand it, but I don't think I should do it myself." She sighed once more. "That's how I feel, too." She looked at her watch, then gathered up her gloves. "I shall have to go." With this return from intimacy to the prosaic world of time and people and appointments, she suddenly woke up again to painful self-consciousness. Had it bored him? Did he think her a fool? She looked into his face, trying to divine his thoughts, then dropped her eyes. "I'm afraid I've been talking a lot about myself," she mumbled. "I don't know why I should burden you." He protested. "I only wish I could be of some help." Joan raised her face again and gave him a quick smile of gratitude. "You've done a lot by just listening." They left the restaurant, and when he had seen her to her bus, he set off on foot towards the British Museum, wondering, as he went, what sort of letter he ought to write to Brian. Should he wash his hands of the whole business and merely scribble a note to the effect that Joan seemed well and happy? Or should he let out that she had told him everything, and then proceed to expostulate, warn, advise? He passed between the huge columns of the portico into the dim coolness within. A regular sermon, he thought, with distaste. If only one could approach the problem as it ought to be approached, as a Rabelaisian joke. But then poor Brian could hardly be expected to see it in that light, even though it would do him a world of good to think for a change in Rabelaisian terms. Anthony showed his card to the attendant and walked down the corridor to the reading room. That was always the trouble, he reflected. You could never influence anybody to be anything except himself, nor influence him by any means that he didn't already accept the validity of. He pushed open the door and was under the dome, breathing the faint, acrid smell of books, millions of books, and all those hundreds of thousands of authors, century after century, each convinced he was right, convinced that he knew the essential secret, convinced that he could convince the rest of the world by putting it down in black and white, when in fact, of course, the only people anyone ever convinced were the ones that nature and circumstances had actually or potentially convinced already. And even those weren't wholly to be relied on. Circumstances changed. What convinced in January wouldn't necessarily convince in August. The attendant handed him the books that had been reserved for him, and he walked off to his seat. Mountains of the spirit's interminable birth pangs, and the result was what? Well, si ridiculum merum requires circumspece. Pleased with his invention, he looked about him at his fellow readers, the men like walruses, the dim females, the Indians emaciated or overblown, the whiskered patriarchs, the youths in spectacles, heirs to all ages, depressing if you took it seriously, but also irresistibly comic. He sat down and opened his book. De Lancre's Tableau de l'inconstance des mauvais anges. at the place where he had stopped reading the day before. Le diable estut en forme de bouche, ayant unque eto de sobs un visage de homme noir, que elle faut contrainte les bassiers. He laughed noiselessly to himself. Another one for Mary, he thought. At 5 he rose, left his books at the desk, and from Holborn took the tube to Gloucester Road. A few minutes later he was at Mary Amberley's front door. The maid opened. She smiled at her familiarity. He smiled at her familiarity, and assuming the privilege of an intimate of the house, ran upstairs to the drawing-room unannounced. "I have a story for you," he proclaimed, as he crossed the room. "A coarse story, I hope," said Mary Amberley from the sofa. Anthony kissed her hand in that affected style he had recently adopted, and sat down. "To the coarse," he said. "All things are coarse." "Yes, how lucky that is!" And with that crooked little smile of hers, that dark glitter between narrowed lids, "a filthy mind," she added, "is a perpetual feast." The joke was old, and not her own. But Anthony's laughter pleased her none the less for that. It was whole-hearted laughter, loud and prolonged, louder and longer than the joke itself warranted. But then it wasn't at the joke that he was really laughing. The joke was hardly more than an excuse. That laughter was his response, not to a single stimulus, but to the whole extraordinary and exciting situation. To be able to talk freely about anything, anything, mind you, with a woman, a lady, a genuine loaf-kneader. As Mrs. Beavis, in his moments of etymological waggery, had been known to say, a true blue English loaf-kneader, who was also one's mistress, had also read Mallarmé, was also a friend of Guillaume Apollinaire, and to listen to the loaf-kneader preaching what she practiced, and casually mentioning beds, water-closets, the physiology of what, for the Saxon words still remain unpronounceable, they were constrained to call l'amour. For Anthony the experience was still, after 2 years, and in spite of Mary's occasional infidelities, an intoxicating mixture of liberation and forbidden fruit, of relief and titillation in his father's universe, in the world of Pauline and the aunts. Such things were simply not there, but not there with a painfully, glaringly conspicuous absence. Like the hypnotized patient who had been commanded to see the 5 of clubs as a piece of virgin pasteboard, they deliberately failed to perceive the undesirable things they were conspiratorially silent about, all they had been blind to. The natural functions, even of the lower animals, had to be ignored. There were silences, even about quadrupeds. That goat incident, for example. It was the theme now of one of Anthony's choicest anecdotes. Exquisitely comic, but how much more comic now than at the time, nearly 2 years before he first met Mary, when it had actually happened, picnicking on the horrible Scheideck Pass, with the Weisshorn hanging over them like an obsession, and a clump of gentians carefully sought out by Mr. Beavis in the grass at their feet. The family had been visited by a half-grown kid, greedy for the salt of their hard-boiled eggs. Shrinking and a little disgusted under their delight, his two small half-sisters had held out their hands to be licked, while Pauline took a snapshot, and Mr. Beavis, whose interest in goats was mainly philological, quoted Theocritus' pastoral scene. But suddenly the little creature had straddled its legs, and still expressionlessly gazing at the Beavis family through the oblong pupils of its large yellow eyes, had proceeded to make water on the gentians. "They're not very generous with their butter, and how jolly the dear old Weishorn is looking today," Pauline and Mr. Beavis brought out almost simultaneously. The one as she peered into her sandwich, in a tone of complaint, the other gazing away far-focused, with a note in his voice of rapture, none the less genuinely Wordsworthian for being expressed in terms of a gentlemanly and thoroughly English fastidiousness. In haste and guilty, the two children swallowed their incipient shriek of startled mirth and averted frozen faces from one another and the outrageous goat. Momentarily compromised, the world of Mr. Beavis and Pauline and the aunts had settled down again to respectability. "And what about your story?" Mrs. Amberley inquired, as his laughter subsided. "You shall hear," said Anthony, and was silent for a little, lighting a cigarette, while he thought of what he was about to say, and the way he meant to say it. He was ambitious about his story, wanted to make it a good one, at once amusing and psychologically profound, a smoking-room story that should also be a library story, a laboratory story. Mary must be made to pay a double tribute of laughter and admiration. "You know Brian Fox?" he began. "Of course. Poor old Brian." By his tone, by the use of the patronizing adjective, Anthony established his position of superiority, asserted his right, the right of the entitled and scientific vivisector, to anatomize and examine. Yes, poor old Brian. That maniacal preoccupation of his with chastity. Chastity, the most unnatural of all the sexual perversions, he added, parenthetically, out of Remy de Gourmont. Mary's appreciative smile acted on him like a spur to fresh efforts. Fresh efforts, of course, at Brian's expense, but at the moment that didn't occur to him. "But what can you expect?" Mrs. Amberley put in. "With a mother like that. One of those spiritual vampires. A regular Saint Monica." Saint Monica by Ari Schaeffer. He found himself overbidding. Not that there was a trace in Mrs. Fox of that sickly insincerity of Schaeffer's saint, but the end of his storytelling, which was to provoke Mary's laughter and admiration, was sufficient justification for any means whatever. Schaeffer was an excellent joke, too good a joke to be neglected, even if he were beside the point. And when Mary brought out what was at the moment her favorite phrase and talked of Mrs. Fox's uterine reactions, he eagerly seized upon the words and began applying them not merely to Mrs. Fox, but also to Joan, and even making another joke out of the physical absurdity of the thing, to Brian. Brian's uterine reactions towards chastity in conflict with his own and Joan's uterine reactions towards the common desires. It was a drama, A drama, he explained, whose existence hitherto he had only suspected and inferred. Now there was no more need to guess, he knew. Straight from the horse's mouth, or rather, straight from the mare's. Poor Joan. The vivisector laid out another specimen on the operating table. Like early Christians, was Mrs. Amberley's comment when he had finished. The virulent contempt in her voice made him suddenly remember, for the first time since he had begun his story, that Brian was his friend, that Joan had been genuinely unhappy. Too late, he wanted to explain that, in spite of all appearances to the contrary, there was nobody he liked and admired and respected more than Brian. "You mustn't misunderstand me," he said. "To Mary, retrospectively, and in imagination, I'm absolutely devoted to him." Inside his head, he became eloquent on the subject. But no amount of this interior eloquence could alter the fact that he had betrayed confidences and been malicious without apology or qualifying explanation. At the time, of course, this malice had seemed to him the manifestation of his own psychological acuteness. These betrayed confidences and indispensable facts, without which the acuteness could not have exercised. But now he found himself all at once confused and tongue-tied with self-reproach. "I felt awfully sorry for Joan," he stammered, trying to make amends. "Promised I'd do all I could to help the poor girl. But what? That's the question. What?" He exaggerated the note of perplexity. Perplexed, he was justified in betraying Joan's confidences. He had told the story, he now began to assure himself, solely for the sake of asking Mary's advice, the advice of an experienced woman of the world. But the experienced woman of the world was looking at him in the most disquieting way. Mrs. Amberley's eyelids had narrowed over a mocking brilliance. The left-hand corner of her mouth was drawn up ironically. "The nicest thing about you," she said judicially, "is your innocence." Her words were so wounding that he forgot, in an instant, Joan, Brian, his own discreditable behavior, and could think only of his punctured vanity. "Thank you," he said, trying to give her a smile of frank amusement. Innocent. She thought him innocent. After their time in Paris, after those jokes about uterine reactions. So deliciously youthful, so touching. "I'm glad you think so." The smile had gone all awry. He felt the blood mounting to his cheeks. "A girl comes to you," Mrs. Amberley went on, "and complains because she hasn't been kissed enough. And here you are, solemnly asking what you ought to do to help her. And now you're blushing like a beetroot. Darling, I absolutely adore you." Laying her hand on his arm, "Kneel down on the floor here," she commanded. Rather sheepishly, he obeyed. Mary Amberley looked at him for a little in silence, with the same bright, mocking expression in her eyes. Then softly, "Shall I show you what you can do to help her?" she asked. "Shall I show you?" He nodded without speaking, but still, at arm's length, she smiled inquiringly into his face. "Or am I a fool to show you?" she asked. "Won't you learn the lesson too well? Perhaps I shall be jealous." She shook her head and smiled, a gay and civilized smile. "No, I don't believe in being jealous." She took his face between her two hands and, whispering, "This is how you can help her," drew him towards her. Anthony had felt humiliated by her almost contemptuous assumption of the dominant role. But no shame, no resentment could annul his body's consciousness of the familiar creepings of pleasure and desire. He abandoned himself to her kisses. A clock struck, and immediately, from an upper floor, came the approaching sound of shrill, childish voices. Mrs. Amberley drew back and, laying a hand over his mouth, pushed him away from her. "You've got to be domestic," she said, laughing. "It's 6. I do the fond mother at 6. Anthony scrambled to his feet and, with the idea of fabricating a little favorable evidence, walked over to the fire and stood there with his elbows on the mantelpiece, looking at the Condor watercolor. The door burst open, and with a yell like the whistle of an express train, a small round child of about 5 came rushing into the room and fairly hurled herself upon her mother. Another little girl, 3 or 4 years old than the first, came hurrying after. "Helen!" she kept calling, and her face, with its expression of anxious disapproval, was the absurd parody of a governess's face. "Helen! You mustn't. Tell her she mustn't shout like that, Mummy." She appealed to Mrs. Amberley. But Mrs. Amberley only laughed and ran her fingers through the little one's thick yellow hair. "Joyce believes in the 10 Commandments," she said, turning to Anthony. "Was born believing in them. Weren't you, darling?" She put an arm round Joyce's shoulder and kissed her. Whereas Helen and I... She shook her head, stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears. "Nanny says it's the drought that gives her a stick neck," Joyce volunteered, and was indignant when her mother and Anthony, and even by uncomprehending contagion, little Helen burst out laughing. "But it's true," she cried, and tears of outraged virtue were in her eyes. "Nanny says so." Chapter 28. June 25th, 1934. The facility with which one could become a Stiggins in modern dress, a much subtler and therefore more detestable, more dangerous Stiggins. For of course Stiggins himself was too stupid to be either intrinsically very bad or capable of doing much harm to other people. Whereas, if I set my mind to it, heaven knows what I mightn't achieve in the way of lies in the soul. Even with not setting my mind to it, I could go far, as I perceived, to my horror, today, when I found myself talking to Purchas, and 3 or 4 of his young people talking about Miller's anthropological approach, talking about peace as a way of life as well as an international policy, the way of life being the condition of any policy that had the least hope of being permanently successful, talking so clearly, so profoundly, so convincingly. The poor devils were listening with their tongues hanging out. Much more convincingly than Purchas himself could have done. That muscular, jocular, Christian style starts by being effective, but soon makes hearers feel that they're being talked down to. What they like is that the speaker should be thoroughly serious, but comprehensible, which is a trick I happen to possess. There I was, discoursing in a really masterly way about the spiritual life, and taking intense pleasure in that mastery, secretly congratulating myself on being not only so clever, but also so good, when all at once I realized who I was, Stiggins, talking about the theory of courage, self-sacrifice, patience, without any knowledge of the practice, talking, moreover, in the presence of people who had practiced what I was preaching so effectively that the proper roles were reversed. They were listening to me, not I to them. The discovery of what I was doing came suddenly. I was overcome with shame, and yet more shameful, went on talking. Not for long, however, a minute or two, and I simply had to stop, apologize, insist that it wasn't my business to talk. This shows how easy it is to be Stiggins by mistake and unconsciously, but also that unconsciousness is no excuse, and that one's responsible for the mistake, which arises, of course, from the pleasure one takes in being more talented than other people and in dominating them by means of these talents. Why is one unconscious? Because one hasn't ever taken the trouble to examine one's motives, and one doesn't examine one's motives because one's motives are mostly discreditable. Alternatively, of course, one examines one's motives but tells oneself lies about them till one comes to believe that they're good, which is the conviction of the self-conscious Stiggins. I've always condemned showing off the desire to dominate as vulgar, and imagine myself pretty free of these vulgarities. But in so far as free at all, free, I now perceive, only thanks to the indifference, which has kept me away from other people, thanks to the external, economic, and internal intellectual circumstances, which made me a sociologist rather than a banker, administrator, engineer, working in direct contact with my fellows. Not to make contacts, I have realized, is wrong, but the moment I make them, I catch myself showing off and trying to dominate. Showing off to make it worse, as Stiggins would have done, trying to dominate by a purely verbal display of virtues which I don't put into practice. Humiliating to find that one's supposed good qualities are mainly due to circumstances and the bad habit of indifference, which made me shirk occasions for behaving badly, or, well, for that matter, seeing that it's very difficult to behave either well or badly, except towards other people, more humiliating still to find that when, with an effort of goodwill, one creates the necessary opportunities, one immediately responds to them by behaving badly. Note: meditate on the virtues that are the contraries of vanity: lust for power, hypocrisy. Chapter 29. May 24th, 1931. The blinds were up. The sunlight lay bright across the dressing table. Helen, as usual, was still in bed. The days were so long, lying in the soft, stupefying warmth of her own body under the quilt. She shortened them with sleep, with vague, inconsequential thoughts, with drowsy reading. The book this morning was Shelley's poems. Warm fragrance, she read, articulating the words in an audible whisper, seemed to fall from her light dress. She saw a long-legged figure in white muslin, with sloping shoulders and breast high set. From her light dress and her loose hair, and were some heavy trees, the air of her own speed has descent wind. The figure was running now, in square-toed pumps, cross-gartered with black ribbon over the white cotton stockings. The sweetness seems to satiate the faint wind, and in the soul a wild odor is felt, beyond the sense, like fiery dews that melt into the bosom of a frozen bud. The half-opened rose gave place to Mark Staith's strangely twisted face. Those things he had told her the other night about perfumes, musk, ambergris, and Henri Quatre, with his bromidrosis of the feet. Bien vous en prendez être roi, sans cela on ne vous pourrait souffrir. Vous pouvez comme charogne. She made a grimace. Hugh's smell was like sour milk. A clock struck. 9, 10, 11, 12. 12. She felt guilty, then defiantly decided that she would stay in bed for lunch. A remembered voice, it was Cynthia's, sounded reproachfully in her memory. You ought to go out more, see more people. But people, Cynthia's people, were such bores behind closed eyelids. She saw her mother rapping the top of her skull. Solid ivory, my dear. Hopelessly stupid, ignorant, tasteless, slow. I was brought up above my mental station, was what she had said to Anthony the other night. So that now, if ever I have to be with people as silly and uneducated as myself, it's torture, absolute torture. Cynthia was sweet, of course, always had been ever since they were at school together. But Cynthia's husband, that retriever, and her young men, and the young men's young women, my boyfriend, my girlfriend, how she loathed the words, and still more, the awful way they spoke them. So coy, such saucy implications of sleeping together, when in fact most of them were utterly respectable. In the few cases where they weren't respectable, it seemed even worse, a double hypocrisy, really sleeping together, and pretending to be only archly pretending to do it. The dreary upper-class Englishness of it all. And then they were always playing games. Games, Mrs. Amberley drawled out, of a pre-morphia past. A dear old school in every home. See more of those people, do more of the things they did. She shook her head. Spouse, sister, angel, pilot of the fate, whose course has been so starless. Was it all nonsense? Or did it mean something marvelous she had never experienced? But yes, she had experienced it. For in the fields of immortality, my spirit should at first have worshipped thine, a divine presence in a place divine. It was humiliating now to admit it, but the fact remained that with Jerry she had known exactly what those lines signified, a divine presence in a place divine, and it had been the presence in bed of a swindler, who was also a virtuoso in the art of love-making. She found a perverse pleasure in insisting, as brutally as she could, upon the grotesque disparity between the facts and what had then been her feelings. I love thee, yes, I feel, that on the fountain of my heart a seal is set to keep its waters pure and bright for thee. Noiselessly, Helen laughed. The sound of the clock chiming the quarter made her think again of Cynthia's advice. There were also the other people, the people they met when Hugh and she dined with the museum or the university, those God-fearing people, her mother spoke again, who still go on fearing God even though they've pitched him overboard, fearing God on committees, fearing him in WEA lecture rooms, fearing him through interminable discussions of the planned society. But Jerry's good looks, Jerry's technique as a lover, how could those be planned out of existence? Or the fetus irrepressibly growing and growing in the womb. A coordinated housing scheme for the whole country. She remembered Frank Ditchling's eager, persuasive voice. He had a turned-up nose, and the large nostrils stared at one like a second pair of eyes, insistently. Redistribution of the population, satellite towns, green belts, lifts even in the working-class flats. She had listened, and had succumbed to the spell of his hypnotic nostrils, and at the time it had seemed splendid, worth dying for. But afterwards, well, lists were convenient. She wished there were one of her own flat. Parks were nice to walk in. But how would Frank Ditchling's crusade affect any of the serious issues? Coordinated housing wouldn't make her mother any less dirty, any less hopelessly at the mercy of an intoxicated body. And would Hugh be any different in a satellite town and with a lift from what he was now when he walked up 4 flights of stairs in London? Hugh, she thought, derisively, of his letters, all the delicate, beautiful things he had written, and then of the man as he had been in everyday reality, as a husband. Show me how I can help you, Hugh. Arranging his papers, typing his notes, looking up references for him in the library, but always his eyes glassy behind glass. He had shaken his head. Either he didn't need help, or else she wasn't capable of giving it. I want to be a good wife, Hugh. With her mother's laughter loud in her imagination, it had been difficult to pronounce those words, but she had meant them. She did want to be a good wife. Darning socks, making hot milk for him before he went to bed, reading up his subject, being serious, in a word, for the first time and profoundly. But Hugh didn't want her to be a good wife, didn't want her, so far as she could see, to be anything, a divine presence in a place divine. But the place was his letters. She was present, so far as he was concerned, only at the other end of the postal system. He didn't even want her in bed, or at any rate, not much, not in any ordinary way. Green belts indeed. It was all beside the point, for the point was those silences in which Hugh enclosed himself at meals. The point was that martyred expression he put on if ever she came into his study while he was working. The point was the furtive squalor of those approaches in the darkness, the revolting detachment and gentleness of a sensuality in which the part assigned to her was purely ideal. The point was that expression of dismay, almost of horror and disgust, which she had detected that time within the first few weeks of their marriage, when she was laid up with the flu. He had shown himself solicitous, and at first she had been touched, had felt grateful. But when she discovered how heroic an effort it had cost him to attend upon her sick body, the gratitude had evaporated. In itself, no doubt the effort was admirable. What she resented, what she couldn't forgive, was the fact that an effort had to be made. She wanted to be accepted as she was, even in fever, even vomiting bile. In that book on mysticism she had read, there was an account of mine Goyen picking up from the floor a horrible gob of phlegm and spittle and putting it in her mouth as a test of will. Sick she had been, Hugh's test of will, and since then, each month had renewed his secret horror of her body. It was an intolerable insult, and would be no less intolerable in one of Ditchling's satellite towns in the planned world those God-fearing atheists were always talking about. But there was also Fanny Carling. The mouse was Helen's name for her. She was so small, so grey, so silently quick, but a mystical mouse, a mouse with enormous blue eyes that seemed perpetually astonished by what they saw behind the appearances of things, astonished but bright at the same time, with an inexplicable happiness, a happiness that to Helen seemed almost indecent, but which she envied. How does one believe in things that are obviously false? She had asked, half in malice, half genuinely desirous of learning a valuable secret. By living, the mouse answered. If you live in the right way, all these things turn out to be obviously true. And she went on to talk incomprehensible stuff about the love of God and the love of things and people for the sake of God. I don't know what you mean. Only because you don't want to, Helen. Stupid, maddening answer. How do you know what I want? Sighing, Helen returned to her book. I was attached to that great sect, whose doctrine is that each one should select out of the crowd a mistress or friend. One of my boyfriends. And all the rest, though fair and wise, commend to cold oblivion, though it is the code of modern morals and the beaten road, which those poor slaves with weary footsteps tread, who travel to their home among the dead, by the broad highway of the world, and so, with one chained friend, perhaps a jealous foe, the dreariest and the longest journey go. The dreariest and the longest, she repeated to herself. But it could be as long, she thought, and as dreary with several as with only one, with Bob and Cecil and Quentin, as with Hugh. True love in this differs from gold and clay, that to divide is not to take away. I don't believe it, she said aloud, and anyhow, there hadn't been much love to divide. For poor little Cecil, she had never pretended to be more than sorry. And with Quentin, it was just hygiene. As for Bob, he had genuinely cared for her, and she, on her side, had done her best to care for him. But under those charming manners of his, under those heroic good looks, there was really nothing. And, as a lover, how hopelessly clumsy he had been, how barbarous and uncomprehending. She had broken with him after only a few weeks, and perhaps she went on to think that was her fate, to lose her heart only to men like Jerry, to be loved only by men like Hugh and Bob and Cecil, to worship cruelty and meanness, be adored by deficiency. The telephone bell rang. Helen picked up the receiver. Hello. It was the voice of Anthony Beavis that answered. He wanted her to dine with him tomorrow. I'd love to, she said, though she had promised the evening to Quentin. There was a smile on her face as she leaned back again on the pillows. An intelligent man, she was thinking, worth 50 of these wretched little Cecils and Quentins. And amusing, charming, even rather good-looking. How nice he had been to her the other night at Mark's dinner. Had gone out of his way to be nice. Whereas that pretentious ass Pitchley had gone out of his way to be rude and snubbing. She had wondered at the time whether Anthony wasn't rather attracted by her. Had wondered and rather hoped so. Now this invitation gave her reasons not only for hoping, but for thinking so as well. She hummed to herself, then suddenly, energetic, threw back the bedclothes. She had decided that she would get up for lunch.